Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Caleb Zakarin, editor of the New Books Network. Today I'm speaking with Peter K. Andersson, author of The Dandy, A People's History of Sartorial Splendor. This new history turns our understanding of the dandy and dandyism on its head. Rather than narrowly treat dandyism as an expression of the upper class, Peter shows how dandyism has been a popular subculture embraced by non-elites, working people, and members of the middle class. With the dandy as a vehicle, Peter takes us through 200 years of social and fashion history. Peter, thanks for joining me today on the New Books Network.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on. This book is extremely interesting and just all of the topics that you cover. I can't say that I'm an expert at all on fashion history, but it really is an unbelievably fascinating vehicle to look at history through. So I'm glad that I got the chance to read the book and looking forward to getting the chance to talk to you about it as well and get to ask you some questions because this really was a new subject for me, something that I've been interested in, but something that I really didn't know much about at all. But before jumping into the book, I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, of course. Thank you for your kind words about my book, first of all. Well, I'm a historian. I've been a historian for quite some time. I got my PhD in 2012, and I'm Swedish, so I've spent most of my working life in Sweden. But my main focus as a historian and as a researcher has been British history, mainly Victorian culture, Victorian popular culture even. But I've also studied early modern history and so on. And right now I have a position as a town historian in a Swedish town called Lund, where I work at the well-known Museum of Cultural History.
Yeah, amazing. What I found interesting too about the book is that, you begin by talking about your own experience too, growing up as a kid. I was wondering if you'd share a little bit about that.
Yes, no, I thought I would give a sort of a personal introduction to the topic in the book because this is something that is quite, it is a bit autobiographical, this topic for me, because as a young man, I had an interest in dress and dress history and especially male fashion and the suit and so on. And it was a way of sort of sticking out, a way of finding an identity as a teenager, I suppose, and also a way of sort of when you sort of feel different in a way in school and so on, you try to find a visual expression that manifests that feeling. So that was my way of doing that. Some people tend to become attached to other subcultures, other music cultures, and so on. But I became some sort of dandy, and I strove to dress like an English old gentleman, so to speak.
The meaning of the word dandy depends a lot on the context as you go through in the book, that it can mean different things in different contexts. But just to situate listeners who might have never even heard of the term before, what does dandy mean?
Well, I suppose there is a sort of everyday definition of the word, which means a man who cares about his appearance, a man who dresses well, and I suppose also by extension, a man who dresses in a more traditional, old-fashioned way. Perhaps that is what we mean when we use the term nowadays. We think of a dandy as someone who uses and perhaps in a more personal way uses the traditional male fashion of the modern period, wearing a suit, but maybe a colorful suit, a colorful tie, and so on. When we speak of dandies in history, I think we go back to the Regency period when the word becomes established, even though it dates back to the 18th century. But in the early 19th century, the dandy becomes a sort of social phenomenon that is identified and becomes very much discussed. And in most works of history, works of literary studies, and so on, the dandy is attached to a certain type of individual. It's often very famous men, from Beau Brummel, who is often identified as the first sort of dandy in history to men like Oscar Wilde or Whitmore or Charles Baudelaire, French writers and so on, who more or less identify themselves as dandies and had a sort of conscious ambition to dress distinctively and to maybe even change men's fashion in a way. So what I'm doing and what I'm trying to do in this book is to tell a different story and to maybe democratize the word dandy in a way.
Absolutely. And I think that that's a really interesting aspect of this history is the way in which it's something that oftentimes is framed as like this upper class phenomenon, but in fact, as you show, has this much more interesting history that almost, the dandy is a type much in the way that like the hippie or the skater or these other modern subcultures that we don't necessarily think about in the same way as the dandy. Actually, it's kind of a type in the same way.
Mm.
You begin by talking about the trial of Geoffrey Nightingale when it kind of people first become familiar with the term dandy. And I was wondering if you could talk about this because I think it's a really interesting story.
Well, I begin the book in the year 1818, which is to me a very pivotal year because that is when the word dandy becomes very much established in newspaper language and the media and the public sphere. And there are a number of different minor court cases that crop up in that year. Perhaps particularly the one that you refer to about a man called Nightingale. And this case, similar to a number of other cases, concerns young men who behave badly in public areas and who destroy shops or who throw stones through windows. Young men behaving badly, essentially. And what's happening in this age is that these young men, these misbehaving young men, are seen as dressed in a very particular way, and they dress up. They dress in a very distinctive way that seems to be designed to attract attention and so on. So the word dandy becomes from the beginning really attached to these rowdy young men, and therefore the word dandy becomes and continues to be during the 19th century a term of abuse almost, a term that is used whenever these rowdy young men are to be derided. So it begins like that. It is quite a sort of rebellious and rowdy history, this, and it continues in much the same vein because when we encounter dandies and other iterations of dandies and through the years, it is often when they have been misbehaving, when they have been doing things that the sort of public sphere deem unfit, but also when and of course in particular when they dress in ways that are not considered appropriate and are considered vulgar. So dandies from the beginning are seen as quite vulgar young men.
How did the dandies of England compare with the calicos in France?
They appear at roughly the same time, but they are distinguished by slightly different types of clothes. What is interesting about all these different dandy categories that I write about in the book from the 1810s up until the late 20th century is that they are all identified with a certain term. Often this word is used of them; they don't use it of themselves. And all these different groups that occur in different decades are sort of characterized by quite a distinctive style, a distinctive type of dress. So it's very much a group culture in all these cases. The dandy isn't that much of an individualist in this history, you might say. And what happens in the early 19th century is that the dandy appears in the 1810s, late 1810s in London, but a different category of young men, very similar to the dandies in many ways, appears in Paris, and they are termed calicos. And these are often lower middle class men, clothes store clerks, who dress in a way that is imitative of soldiers when they live in the civilian life. And this is common of both dandies and calicos. So they use spurs on their boots. They adopt moustaches because that is um, associated with military fashion and so on. It's and that is also, I think, why these categories are very much derided, because they imitate the style of the soldier, but they are men who hasn't fought in any wars.
How did dandies fit into the overall culture of Victorian England?
Well, I think it depends on what type of dandy we're talking about. Of course, there are the famous dandies, and I don't know how much they were called dandies by their own times. Maybe we have identified some of them as dandies posthumously. But the category of dandies that I write about in this book, they were scorned and viewed quite with quite a lot of hostility, at least by the press and by the sort of higher stratus of society. But of course, among these people themselves, it was a very popular way of dressing. And dandyism, what I call popular dandyism, was of course very widespread, because you can see fashions all through the 19th century spreading all across England, across Europe, of course, and so on. So quite evidently, the fashions associated with various forms of popular dandyism were very popular and were very much disseminated among these young men.
What is the swell dandy? Because we start to see all of these different types of dandies proliferate, as you say. There isn't just one, which makes it hard to define. What is swell dandy?
Yeah, well, the thing is that the word dandy becomes established in the sort of 1810s, roughly. But then the word dandy isn't that common to use about these different men. So in different decades, you have different terms that become popular to use about these dandified young men. So in the 1820s, there is quite a lot of talk about swells. Later in the 19th century, the word swell becomes more blurry. It becomes used of in the same way as you might say toff or something like that, like a sort of aristocratic type, well-dressed gentleman. But in the 1820s, the swell was viewed with very much more disdain, and it was the sort of first heir to the dandy, the Regency dandy that had been before that. And the swells were, just as the previous types, often identified as very disruptive, very vandalistic young men in London mainly. And it was an era of a peace, coming in between the Napoleonic Wars and the Crimean War, when there was a sort of general worry in Victorian society about an idle young generation who had no sort of way of directing their aggressions and their youthful energies. So they were worried about these young men because they didn't have any military experience. They didn't grow up as soldiers or anything like that. So there was something very disconcerting about these young men. Who were, as you say, called swells in the 1820s. And then we continue through the 19th century. In the 1830s, you still talk about swells, but then you start to talk about gents, which is a different chapter in my book. Later in the 19th century, we talk about mashers in the 1880s and 90s and so on. So you can see that different terms are used in almost every decade but basically it's about the same type of young men who have the ambition of being dandies, essentially.
Yeah, it's an interesting pattern that, you know, young men more or less behaving in similar ways, maybe dressing slightly differently, getting different, being called by different names, yet it's kind of the same thing. And I think that's an interesting trend that you sort of follow through this book, and probably made the work for it quite interesting, actually, trying to trace how this term, this sort of idea of the dandy, changed in different places. Like one of the chapters that you have that's very interesting to me is you look at dandyism in 19th century America, specifically with the descendants of slaves coming to northern cities like New York and embracing dandyism. So could you talk a little bit
Mm.
about this chapter?
Yeah, that's of course a very interesting aspect of this history, and we talk today quite a lot about Black dandyism, and it's still quite a sort of active cultural trope, you might say. But it stems from a sort of racist stereotype, really, that emerges in the 18th and early 19th century, which was that these black slaves, black servants in America, that they had a sort of penchant for flamboyant clothing, and that they wanted to dress up when they were on their spare time and so on. And this was very much derided, and it also went into the very popular cultural stereotype of the black-faced minstrel and the dandy coon, as it was called. And it was a highly racist caricature, of course, of the black man. But then this stereotype was also, in a way, sort of caricatured by the black men themselves, because as a way of getting across their identity, communicating their independence, their pride, and so on. There was a culture of dandyism among the black slaves and eventually the freed black slaves all across Northern America. So it emerged as a sort of culture among these, of course, very materially deprived African slaves to dress up when they had the ability to do so. And in a way, they sort of did this to sort of parody the parody. But you can find quite a lot of newspaper clippings from throughout the 19th century, reports about these black men when they have been confronted with the white society, when they are seen as provocative through their clothes, and they in some cases they were quite consciously provoking the whites and so on. We have cases of Rosa Parks like cases of black dandies sitting in the white sections on streetcars and so on, refusing to budge even when they are told to do so and so on. So there was some sort of rebellion going on through this black dandyism, even in the mid 19th century. So it's a very interesting story and very, of course, necessary to tell in this book because even though dandyism as a phenomenon might have originated in Europe, it very much permeated North America during the 19th century, thanks to the black population.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll definitely talk about, present day dandyism. I live in, New York City where you do see dandies still, and there's quite a culture around it, very much embedded in, in fashion today. But we'll get there. You mentioned a little bit the other subculture, or the other term, the masher. So if you
Mm.
could talk a little about the masher, because you devote quite a bit of the book to this
Yeah,
person.
yeah. The masher it becomes a very common term to use of dandy-like young men in the 1880s and 90s. And it's quite, I think the term originates in America, but it becomes especially popular in England and Europe. And it becomes used of a certain type of young men who attend a new type of theatre that emerges in late Victorian London. Um, the Gaiety is a very popular theatre, which has a new innovation, for want of a better word, an innovation called ballet girls, which is scantily clad young women, essentially, on stage. And so this becomes a sort of craze among young men to sit in the audience and really ogle these women. So it's a very, very interesting masculine culture that emerges there in the 1880s, 90s. And it becomes associated with a new fashion, special types of clothes. And in the 1890s, the mashers, especially on the European continent, become associated with a very strange type of dress. They wear wide trousers, very wide trousers. They wear yellow pointed leather shoes, monocles. They wear bowler hats that are too small. They wear walking sticks that are short and very thick, so you can't really lean on them. You just hold them. All of these different, strange to us accessories that become very much associated, and it becomes almost a type of uniform for these young men. So in England and the English-speaking countries, they're called mashers. In the German-speaking countries, where this phenomenon is very common, they are called Gigerl, and it also exists in Scandinavia and Southern Europe and so on. So it's a very widespread, strange almost subculture.
It reminds me almost of the Droogs of A Clockwork Orange in a way. I
Oh
know that's
yes,
like probably a very a very extreme version, but I'm sure that there was some inspiration that was taken
yeah, yeah.
for the book and film.
Yes, yeah. No, it's not miles apart from this actually. So yeah, there is something that might have inspired this. Yeah.
It's yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, you then move into the 20th century where there's some changes, and one of the chapters that's very fascinating is you look at transgender dandies in Paris and Berlin in the interwar period. And the interwar period is just it's a fascinating cultural moment because
Mm.
there's so much new developments in art and in fashion. So I was wondering if you could talk a little about the research that you did for this chapter because it is, I think, quite interesting and also just very relevant to today
Mm.
as well.
Oh yes. I mean, of course, what I was thinking when I was writing this book, which is the majority of the research about this going into this book is of course about men, and the clothes that dandies wear are traditionally men's clothing, the suits and the ties and so on. But I was thinking quite early on that women have also contributed to the development of the suit, and other associated accessories, of course. And particularly, I found in the interwar period when the transgender dandy, when lesbian subculture in especially Berlin and Paris becomes very accentuated. And in Berlin, of course, during the Weimar Republic, homosexual culture in general was very it was allowed to blossom in a way that it hadn't before, perhaps. So in that way, there were uh, lesbian nightclubs, different bars, and so on that catered to this subculture and to this clientele. And of course, the question becomes relevant. I'm doing a people's history of dandyism here. So to what extent were these transgender dandies common women? Were they women from the lower classes and so on? Maybe to a limited extent, but I think even if you only find photographs from the more high-end nightclubs of women wearing tuxedos and so on, it seems to have been there seems to have been a certain fashion for especially two things: women dressing in a tuxedo and women wearing a monocle, which seems to have been particularly common in Germany. And of course, this is quite interesting because these are traditionally male coded items. And And I think what women did in this era is to sort of parody these things, especially the tuxedo, which almost from the beginning, when it emerges in the 1910s and 20s, it's parodied almost immediately because it's so distinctive in a way. It's so black and white, and it's very much associated with a sort of upper class air. So I think it was unavoidable to play with that, and I think for the lesbian subculture that existed in these countries, it was very easy to adopt this and to play with it and comment on it in an ironic fashion. But you can find quite a lot of references to women wearing monocles as well, and I think maybe this is a bit of our prejudice about the sort of Weimar Republic and German culture, women wearing monocles. There is something German about this. I think that has sort of become quite established in our subconscious. But it begins there, and I think it's very interesting to see how these male coded objects are adopted and sort of become part of their repertoire, but in a sort of ironic way.
That seems to be a through line of the dandy, of this sort of self-conscious, almost ironic
Yeah,
usage of upper class fashion as a sort of either to the outside it might represent one thing, that it might be a way for them to get away, see it as like they can get away with certain things, or
mm.
on the to their own inner group, it's a kind of a wink and a
Yeah.
nod of like, I know what I'm doing.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. And I think that's exactly it, because with a lot of these subcultures and fashions, you think, did they really dress like that? I mean, did they do that seriously and so on? But there is a sort of uh, tongue-in-cheek element to this that is very fascinating, because, of course, to outsiders, to journalists, and so on, it's always derided. It's always seen as, oh, they think they can dress as upper class men and so on, dress as their betters, as they say. But I think when you were part of this group and when you were inside of it, there was an ironic element that was, I think, and of course, a very self-conscious element that was very much there. And I think this becomes very apparent when you move into the 1940s and you have the zoot suits and the similar fashions, which sort of spreads almost across the globe. And these are, of course, extreme fashions that are self-conscious, that are quite ironic in their way.
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
The zoot suit is definitely that big. It's, for those who don't know, like the zoot suit is a very large suit. It's almost,
yeah.
it stands out as as quite baggy. Um, but there's such an interesting history with the zoot suit and its
Yeah.
importance in culture, and like you said too, the way in which it's kind of symbol, and this outfit is spread. So could you talk a little about the history of the zoot suit?
Yeah, I mean it's almost too good a subject to skip, really, because it so goes into this very interesting and tumultuous time in modern history. It's the 1940s, so the zoot suit starts to become a thing in America, and it's generally associated with the black minority or the Mexican minority, but it seems to have been adopted by white youngsters as well. And it's the big hat and mainly the big, broad-shouldered jacket, of course, and the connection with swing jazz and so on. And then it becomes adopted in Europe as well, and it has a certain. It's adopted in slightly varying ways across Europe. So there is the Parisian version, and they call the Zazoos. There is the German version, and that's the Swingjugend. In Vienna, there's a slightly scruffier version, and they're called Schlurfs. And all of these European versions, they are very much associated with a sort of counterculture, revolting against the Nazi regimes and so on. So it's a very interesting tool in that conflict, and it becomes very very much enmeshed with the Second World War, of course. I mean, it's spreading beyond that. Even there are Czech versions, Russian versions. It even becomes common in South Africa, as I write about in the book. So it's almost a global phenomenon. Not quite, but almost.
It's so remarkable the impact, the influence that we're still feeling in a way from the British youth subcultures of the 50s and 60s. The rockers, the mods, the obviously the rockers are on sort of the opposite side of the spectrum
Yes.
of the dandy, but the mods not as much.
Mm.
And I don't think that a lot of people know about the mods anymore. Obviously, if you listen to the band The Who, their
Mm.
logo is they borrow some mod subcultural imagery.
Yeah.
But can you talk a little about the mods?
Yeah, I think in England it begins with what is called the Teddy Boys in the 1950s, and then it goes into the mods, the mod culture becomes there is quite a bit of previous research done on mod culture, because that is really almost the first of these what you might call dandy subcultures that become a global phenomenon. You can find it in Japan, you can find it in Russia or Africa and so on. And I think this is completely due to the new media landscape that exists in the 1960s, with the radio, television, and so on. And of course, mod culture. I don't know if it's still remembered as much in America as it is in Europe. I think there might still be quite a few mods around here in Europe, but it is of course very much linked with the music culture of the 1960s. The sort of the drainpipe trousers, the and so on, the anoraks and everything. It's a sort of it's maybe, or you might call it a precursor to nerd culture in the late 20th, early 21st century, because I think you can find subcultures in our age that sort of make quite clear references to mod culture. But I think mod culture is also an interesting way of seeing how the sort of quite local dandy subcultures that I have been discussing earlier in the book now become a mass culture. Now it's mediatized in a different way, and you have pop bands being mods, you have celebrities in quite a different way than earlier, and so on. So something is happening here, and I think maybe we start to see the end of this popular dandyism that I write about, which existed earlier, because now dandyism becomes one of many styles available to almost anyone around the globe. So there is a dissemination and a democratization going on that sort of changes the way fashion landscape looks. So there is a transition there going on, I think.
Sort of following the chronological aspect of the book, you then look at the rise or the popularity really of dandyism in sub-Saharan Africa in the late 20th century. Could you talk about this chapter, because this is an unbelievably fascinating phenomenon?
Yes, and this is it's been quite publicized in some ways. This sub-Saharan African dandyism that really starts to become common in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and it's especially in South Africa and the two Congos, Brazzaville, and I think is maybe the sort of capital of this type of dandyism. It has different denominations. The dandies in Congo are called sapeurs, and they even have their own club and so on. And this is, of course, a dandyism. And once again, this type of black dandyism is a tool in a project of finding your identity, especially a post-colonial identity after sort of abolishment of colonial rule in Africa, and dandyism there becomes something very distinct and very colorful in that sort of interpretation. Um, and I think it's very fascinating. I'm not sure how much this dandyism still lives on in Brazzaville or in Johannesburg. I think it might be still there, but I think its adherents are older. It's not a youth culture anymore, maybe. But it's very interesting that it's of all places in the world, dandyism became established there, and Congo is virtually the sort of hotspot of dandyism um, in the late 20th century. That is where dandyism has its sort of pulsating heart, really, as opposed to where it originated. So that's very fascinating, and of course, it tells an interesting story about the spread of Western culture, colonialization, but also what is a running thread through my book about the sort of response to authorities, response to the powers, and so on, that becomes mediated through the dandy's suit, really.
You make this connection at the end of the book between dandyism and hipsterism. Um, I certainly, I agree in a way that that there is a sense that whatever there was a golden age of hipsterism that maybe ended in around 2011, 2012 or something like that. Uh,
Yeah.
and it does seem sort of true in a way that, when it comes to these sorts of subcultures, that it isn't really like someone embraces a subculture in the way that they used to. Now there's such a, there's so many subcultures all happening all at once that people
Mm.
pick and grab different ones. And hipsterism feels like almost like it's not really so much as a subculture, but as like a way that people can pick and borrow different aspects of subcultures that
Mm.
they like.
Mm.
Um, so I was wondering if you talk a little bit about hipsterism and how you sort of end the book, your parting thoughts on dandyism.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think hipsterism is interesting to relate to dandyism because it's not the same thing, but it is similar in some ways. I mean, the way I don't know if anyone calls themselves a hipster. It tends to be someone calling someone else a hipster and so on. And then, of course, I think it's difficult to say exactly what a hipster looks like. I mean, what kinds of clothes? I mean, there are some items of clothing maybe that are associated with hipsterism, but it's also quite more of an amalgamated, more varied, fragmented type of culture, maybe. So the hipster is more of a vague figure than perhaps the dandy was 200 years back. But I think it's interesting to relate dandyism to hipsterism because maybe hipsterism is what we're left with. That maybe that's the sort of heir to the dandyism that I write about in this book. Because I don't think, as you say, that there is a more variation of subcultures going on right now, and you can pick and choose whichever you like. So I don't think popular dandyism in the way that I write about it exists anymore to that extent. I mean, sure, there are small groups and clubs of self-confessed dandies all around the globe, but not to the extent that it's sort of it's a fashion, it's a trend in a certain city or a certain country in the way that I identify earlier. So there is something that has happened, and it probably has to do with a new media landscape, a new fashion landscape, but also that the sort of the ideals and the role models of today are different than they were 100 or 200 years ago. So I think when young men in the 19th century wore a suit or a hat or a tie in their own distinctive way, now a hipster would wear overalls or something like that in a distinctive way, or a chimney sweep's hat or something like that. So there is a more sort of idealization of the working class stereotype maybe in hipsterism that is not different from the dandyism before. So there is it's connected to it, but something different. So that's the sort of situation that I try to identify in the end of the book. And so yeah, so I mean, I'm sure people have different ideas about where dandyism has gone, and if there might be subcultures of popular dandyism still around somewhere. I'm very interested to learn about that if anyone knows.
Right. And I'm sure like anything, like these cultural trends, they come, there's a cycle, even if they're different, there's a cyclicality to them too. So I'm sure it won't be
Hmm.
too long before there's some resurgence of dandyism. I certainly think that, you know, it gets quite confused because of what you were sort of saying just a minute ago, that
Mm.
people might dress like a dandy one day and then the next day they dress like a chimney sweep. So
Mm.
it might be hard to, hard to pinpoint
Mm.
um, these sorts of subcultures because of how varied people are in their
Mm.
dress and in their style. So maybe there's some sort of something new emerging in that way. But I think it's a really, the history that you tell is really fascinating, and definitely, um, I think for anyone who has like a very, simplistic notion of what the dandy is, like I had coming in, that you kind of explode the expectations. So I really appreciate this book, and I think it's a very fun history to read,
Mm.
to kind of look at the last 200 years of cultural history through this lens. So, Peter, thank you so much for being guest on the New Books Network. It was really great to get the chance to speak with you.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.